December 29, 1942. Manchester, England rain moved in thin, uneven lines over the blackout city. Each drop struck the tin roofs with a tired rhythm, lost among the hum of distant factories still running on borrowed power. Inside a small maintenance hut behind the Northern Munitions plant, Sergeant Harold Minton sat beside a dead generator. The light from his lantern trembled against the wet walls. His gloves were damp, his breath short and visible. The smell of burnt oil and wet wool hung heavy. Regulations pinned above the door reminded him of his orders. Wait for official components from London. They would arrive in 12 hours. But the storm outside had already cut 2 transmission lines. If the generator wasn't repaired, the plant and the searchlights it powered would go dark by nightfall. Minton leaned closer to the machine. The copper coils were stripped, insulation burned away by last night's surge. He knew what it needed: a precise gauge of wire, properly sealed, properly signed off. None of that existed here. Only scraps, fragments, and one rusted spool marked "unfit for field use." The safe choice was to wait. The correct choice, according to the book, was to do nothing. But through the rain, the faint pulse of anti-aircraft guns echoed from the coast. Somewhere out there, enemy bombers were forming. The blackout sky would soon become a map for destruction. He unrolled the damaged spool, inspecting each brittle strand. The wire was thin, uneven, but still conductive. He glanced again at the notice board. Unauthorized modification of defense equipment. Court-martial offense. The line blurred before his eyes. His hands, trembling not from fear but from cold, reached for the pliers. A quiet click, the sound of decision. By afternoon, the rain had turned to mist. The hut's single bulb flickered as the improvised circuit began to hum. A smell of hot metal filled the air. Minton stepped back, listening. The old generator coughed, resisted, then turned. The vibration traveled through the floorboards, steady and mechanical. Outside, the perimeter lights revived. One by one, pale halos cutting through the fog. It wasn't regulation. It wasn't approved. But it worked. At 7 p.m., a German Heinkel formation crossed the coast. Searchlights over Manchester turned the night sky white. Batteries opened fire. Observers later confirmed the northern sector stayed lit. Bombs fell elsewhere. The plant remained untouched. At dawn, the inspection team arrived from London. They found the wire fix, soldered without authorization, wrapped with what looked like adhesive tape and steel scrap. The senior officer wrote one sentence in his report: "Generator restored through unsanctioned method. System integrity preserved. No medal, no commendation. Just another line in maintenance records, filed and forgotten." Weeks later, the same generator powered the assembly line for anti-aircraft shells used over the channel. The patched wire remained in place until war's end. The men who inspected it later called it Minton's glue and wire fix, though his name never left the ledger. Steel won't remember who tightened the bolt. Circuits don't record hesitation. They only obey current. Would you have waited for London or turned the switch? Before the war, Harold Minton worked in a tram depot outside Leeds. The workshop was small, its windows clouded with years of soot. He spent his days bent over metal, tracing faults others had already written off as scrap. Co-workers called him slow. They said he wasted time on hopeless pieces. Yet, day after day, the trams left his bay running smoother than before. Minton never argued. He spoke through precision. A tightened bolt, a sealed wire, a hum restored to steady rhythm. To him, every machine held memory. It remembered how it once worked, if someone listened long enough. When war began, the depot's silence changed to the roar of mobilization. Minton was assigned to the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, his tools repacked under military inventory. In the new order, patience became inefficiency. Improvisation became risk. Each task had to follow the manual, each repair stamped, each hour accounted for. But some habits survived discipline. Minton still carried a small tin in his breast pocket. Glue, wire scraps, a strip of insulation tape folded twice over. Civilian relics. They weren't regulation, but they were familiar. A craftsman's safety net against failure. He cleaned his tools the same way he always had. Rag soaked in solvent, slow circular motion, the steel warming under his palm. The routine steadied him. Others smoked or joked to pass the time. Minton worked through silence. He believed reliability came not from power, but from rhythm, from knowing the exact resistance of a stubborn thread, or the faint vibration before a fuse failed. Machines spoke in quiet signals. Most men were too loud to hear them. In 1942, when he was transferred to Manchester's munitions district, that silence grew heavy. The city worked without pause. Night shifts under blackout curtains, sparks from grinders hidden behind heavy drapes. He learned to measure fatigue in the hum of motors, to sense when a generator strained. Each failure meant delay. Each delay meant darkness. When he arrived at the maintenance hut that winter, he found the same patterns he'd known his whole life. Burnt copper, stripped casing, overworked bearings. Only now, a misstep could black out a city. By then, Minton's reputation had become a quiet rumor among the crews. They said he could make anything run. Pumps, welders, even a broken radio with no proper coil. Some joked that he could power a convoy on stubbornness alone. He ignored the talk. His faith was in method, not miracle. Glue and wire, pressed steady, made systems live again. He trusted that over theory, over orders written far away. That night, as the rain gathered on the hut's roof, his hands moved with the same calm they once did on tram lines. The same patience his officers called wasteful now dictated each movement. Strip, twist, bind, seal. It was the rhythm of repair, a ritual older than the war itself. The war demanded speed, but survival came from care. By dawn, the generator turned. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. Power returned to the lines, and the searchlights burned through the fog. His small tin sat open beside him. Glue smudged, wire ends blackened, tools arranged in neat order. He would clean them again before morning inspection. Metal remembers the hands that mend it. Systems endure because someone refuses to let them fail. Would you have trusted the manual or your own hands? The power station that supplied Manchester was more than a facility. It was a living artery, feeding light and current into the northern body of Britain's war industry. Its circuits reached across 40 square miles, into factories, foundries, rail yards, and air defense posts. Voltage maps were drawn by hand in the early days of the Blitz. Each transformer bore a number stenciled in white, each junction recorded in a bound logbook signed in ink. Nothing moved in silence. When current flowed, it sang through the lines, a pulse measured, logged, and repeated. Minton's section maintained the outermost chain. He and his men worked in huts spaced across the county, small relay points between stations. They checked meters, replaced coils, and signed forms in triplicate. Every switch was regulated by order. Every failure reported through ranks. The system demanded discipline, predictability over initiative. It was built to run like clockwork, and like any clock, it feared improvisation. By 1942, the grid was stretched thin. Airfields had multiplied faster than new substations could be built. Anti-aircraft sites drew heavy current each night. Runway lights took the rest. One fault could darken 100 square miles. Engineers worked in overlapping shifts, never sleeping more than 4 hours at a time. Still, the system held a network of copper veins and human endurance. In that design, every node mattered equally. Yet each node was forbidden to act alone. The manuals were clear. No unsanctioned repair, no substitute materials, no deviation from London's code. That was how the structure survived, by removing judgment from the field. Minton understood it, even respected it. But in practice, The same rigidity that ensured stability also created paralysis. A single failed generator, waiting for parts, could silence 5 towns. The rain that night blurred the telegraph lines. Reports lagged. Orders stalled. The London warehouse closed at 6:01 p.m. The chain of authorization would resume at dawn. Until then, the entire northern sector existed in procedural suspension. A blackout waiting to happen. Inside Minton's hut, the silence of that system became audible. A generator stood still, not for lack of fuel, but for lack of permission. The irony was plain to every technician in Britain's wartime grid. The structure built for resilience could not survive human waiting. Every layer of oversight insulated the system from failure and from repair. Steel towers stood tall, cables thick with frost, but the lifeblood of the grid was paper. Paper with signatures. Paper that could not conduct current. Minton's task, officially, was to guard a dead circuit until help arrived. Unofficially, he was the last link between blackout and continuity. The network had no room for instinct, yet depended entirely on men who could act before instruction. That contradiction powered the war as much as electricity itself. By dawn, the current flowed again. The grid never noted how. Reports would list temporary restoration by local personnel. The lights stayed on. The records stayed clean. Systems survive because someone disobeys in silence. Would you have followed the order or restored the current? By afternoon, the hut had taken on a weight of its own. The air felt thick, part damp, part current. The voltmeter needle wavered, jerking between numbers that no longer meant certainty. A faint smell of ozone bled through the insulation. Smoke rose in soft curls from the secondary coil, too thin to see unless the lantern flickered. Minton rubbed his gloved thumb over the meter casing. The vibration beneath it wasn't steady anymore. The circuit was breathing unevenly. Outside, the usual sound of lorries had vanished. The fuel convoys that passed each hour were gone, rerouted south after the morning's air raid. Only wind moved now, pushing sleet against the siding. The silence between gusts was wider than before. Without the hum of engines, the war felt distant. A quiet waiting, stretched thin across the power lines. He opened the logbook and checked the timings. 3:42 p.m., voltage drop, minor. Temperature, rising. He noted each in pencil, then stopped halfway down the page. The smell of hot varnish drifted again, sharp enough to cut through wool and rain. Somewhere far off, sirens gave a brief, uncertain call. A test or a mistake? The sound reached him, hung for a second, and died. He leaned close to the machine. The secondary coil had begun to sweat, droplets forming along its casing. He touched the frame lightly. It was hotter than it should be. The grid was still alive, but its pulse was irregular. Minton stood still, listening. The hum of current ran through the concrete floor. Slow, stuttering, and out of rhythm. A living network, suffocating under its own caution. A voice cracked through the field radio. Words buried in static. Hold position. Engineers en route by nightfall. The transmission repeated twice, slower each time. Then silence. Minton looked at the handset. The cord coiled like a dead snake. Orders, always clear. Always late. He set the radio aside and checked his watch again. The minute hand crawled forward, heavy and deliberate. April 44. PM outside. Daylight thin to the color of tin. Sleet hissed against the windows. He adjusted the regulator to relieve pressure, just enough to keep the line breathing. Sparks flashed briefly, then faded. The hum steadied. He exhaled. Not relief, just pause. The rule book said, observe, not act. But observation alone wouldn't stop a blackout. By 16 Wur, the generator casing rattled under its own strain. Minton could hear it even when he stepped back. The uneven tick of an overworked heart. He logged it in quiet handwriting. Stability declining. Awaiting engineers. He underlined nothing. He knew no one would read it until morning. The sleet turned heavier, sweeping sideways across the yard. Somewhere beyond the fog, transformers along the line began to click irregularly. Relay arms breaking pattern. A system designed for certainty was now running on hesitation. Inside the hut, Minton sat beside the generator. The voltmeter still trembled, its needle searching for a balance it would never find. He could feel the charge beneath his boots, restless and unsupervised. The network was weakening, not from enemy fire, but from its own obedience. Machines don't wait. People make them wait. Regulations forbade improvised joins. Every manual repeated the rule. A single spark could ground a line or burn a station. The text was absolute. No repairs without certified parts. No substitutions. No field improvisation. Minton had read it often enough to remember the phrasing by weight, not words. Yet as the sleet turned heavier and the voltage needle trembled near failure, he realized what the rule didn't say. It didn't account for silence. It didn't account for waiting while power bled away. He opened his pouch slowly, the gesture mechanical, deliberate. Inside were the things he wasn't meant to have: a tin of adhesive resin, a coil of stripped wire, and a narrow strip of metal salvaged from an old fuse bracket. Each piece carried memory. Each had once belonged to something that failed and been made to work again. He laid them out on the bench like instruments in a ritual. Outside, the convoy roads had gone quiet. The hum of engines, the metallic pulse of passing trucks, gone. Only wind and the faint buzz of distant current that refused to die. He could hear it in the floor, faint but stubborn. The generator was still alive, but its pulse was weakening. Minton turned the coil between his fingers. His father had taught him that wire wasn't just metal, it was trust. If the current's honest, he used to say, the wire will hold. In the tram shop, that had been gospel. Here, in uniform, it was heresy. He looked at the rulebook pinned to the wall, the official seal printed above neat instructions, then back to the generator's cracked insulation. The choice was simple: wait for permission, or act before the system stopped breathing. He tore a small strip of tape and began cleaning the copper ends. Each movement was unhurried. His breath fogged against the lantern glass. The sound of aircraft engines, distant, layered, pressed faintly through the sleet. No formation yet, but close enough that the air seemed to carry their rhythm. He tightened his grip on the wire. The smell of resin filled the hut. At 4:23, the voltmeter needle dropped, then flicked once, twice, and settled at 0. The current had broken. Minton did not look up. He stripped another inch of wire, sanded the edge of the bracket, and aligned the ends. The field manual called this a breach of procedure. He called it continuation. The adhesive hissed faintly as it sealed under his touch. A spark snapped, brief but contained. For a second, he froze. Then, slowly, the hum returned. Weak, uneven, but alive. He adjusted the bracket, pressing it firm until the sound stabilized. The light above flickered once, then held. The line had survived. He wrote nothing in the logbook, only wiped his hands, closed the tin, and listened. The aircraft sound had moved west. The system's pulse steadied beneath the concrete. The war outside went on, unaware that one unauthorized join had held an entire sector's light. Machines obey the hands that keep them breathing. Systems survive because someone chooses not to wait. At 6:07 p.m., Harold Minton broke regulation. The act was simple, almost unnoticeable. A man leaning over a machine, his breath steady, his tools quiet. But on paper, it was a violation worthy of discharge. He tore back the last layer of insulation and exposed the raw copper beneath. The air smelled of damp cloth and ozone. The rulebook said stop. The current demanded now. He mixed adhesive resin with a small brush, the bristles clotted and stiff from use. The mixture hardened too fast in the cold air, but he pressed it into place anyway. The damaged coil hissed faintly, alive under his touch. He wound stripped wire around the fracture, tight and uneven, each turn pulling current closer to order. From his ration stove, he drew a thin flame and passed it across the joint. Glue smoked. Sparks snapped. The light above him flickered, guttered, and then caught again. For a moment, he thought it would fail. Outside, fog rolled over the rooftops, the kind that swallowed both distance and sound. Beyond it, faint engine noise echoed, the distant pattern of aircraft turning inland. The city was invisible now, only shapes behind rain. He adjusted the voltage dial, felt resistance, and held it. The hum deepened. The relay clicked once, then again, precise and rhythmic, as if the circuit had remembered itself. He stepped back. The voltmeter needle rose and held steady. The generator's tone was lower than before. A quiet, stable vibration that carried through the floor and up his boots. The current had returned, rough around the edges but whole. Minton exhaled. He wiped his forehead, not realizing the sweat was mostly rain. He checked his wristwatch. 6:10 p.m. Less than 3 minutes since the break. To the system, nothing had happened. To the night, everything had. He closed the tin of resin, his hands trembling from effort. A small burn mark darkened the inside of his wrist, where the copper had sparked against skin. He pressed it once, then let it sting. No record would note it. No report would list it. The power lines outside carried on, their current merging into the larger rhythm of the grid. Minutes later, the streetlights along the northern edge flickered alive. Through the fog, faint halos formed above the wet pavement, fragile but real. Somewhere down the line, a siren wound up into readiness, its circuit restored by a repair no one had authorized. Minton stood still, listening. The hum was steady now. He could hear it beneath everything. The rhythm of an industrial body restored by glue, wire, and a quiet act of defiance. There were no cheers, no observers, no confirmation of success. Only the faint glow outside, holding steady against the dark. He picked up his gloves and returned them to his pouch. The tin clicked shut. Rain continued on the roof, measured, exact, like a metronome counting the seconds of an unrecorded victory. The grid never knew his name. The light stayed on because a man decided not to wait for orders. Systems endure because someone breaks the rule at the precise moment it matters. Would you have risked the spark? Or watched the line go dark? At 7 to 12 p.m., the Luftwaffe reached the coast. Radar stations marked 20 aircraft crossing the North Sea. Altitude 10,000 feet. Course set for Manchester. The alerts moved inland by relay, post to post, along the same current Minton had kept alive. In the operations room, map pins shifted, phones rang once, and the chain of defense engaged. Searchlight teams along the perimeter reported full visibility. Beams rose through low cloud, sweeping the sky in coordinated arcs. Anti-aircraft batteries aligned by signal, each position powered through the same northern grid. Had the generator failed as predicted, the system would have collapsed in sequence. 5 towns into darkness, then the airfields, then the city itself. But the current held. The lights that should have failed remained steady, their circuits alive through one unrecorded repair. Above the channel, pilots saw the pattern from miles away, a faint, glowing grid beneath them, like a net of light stretched across the earth. The first intercepts began near the estuary. Searchlights caught the bombers' bellies, reflecting dull silver through fog. Fire control officers adjusted bearings by the second, their instruments ticking in rhythm. Shells burst between the formations. The city's defenders could see every turn. Down in the maintenance hut, the same rhythm echoed in smaller form, a steady mechanical pulse beneath the rain. Minton sat beside the humming generator, the lantern casting thin shadows across the floor. His logbook lay open to a clean page. He wrote with deliberate strokes. Power restored via emergency loop. The words were regulation safe, vague enough to satisfy any audit. He underlined nothing. Outside, faint vibrations passed through the concrete. The concussion of distant flak. He listened, counting the intervals between blasts. Somewhere in that invisible sky, men fought in circles of light he had unknowingly preserved. The system did not thank him. It simply worked. By 7:45 p.m., the reports filtered back. 4 bombers down, 2 damaged, none reached the industrial zone. The blackout chain that should have started at 1807 never came. Every circuit north of the city held its load. Command credited the efficiency of the network. London sent a brief note of commendation. Sector resilience confirmed. No mention of the hut. No mention of the man. Minton leaned back, his shoulders pressing against the cold wall. The resin on his hands had hardened into a dull crust. He closed the logbook, folded the pencil into the binding, and sat still. The hum of the generator filled the silence between distant artillery reports. He looked at the floor where the copper had scorched the boards and rubbed it with his boot until the mark faded. To the grid, the event never existed. To the record, the lights had never flickered. Yet for one winter night, a line of improvised copper had carried an entire sector through the dark. The war would remember the bombers, the guns, the pilots in the sky, but not the man who refused to wait for permission. Systems endure because someone, somewhere, ignores the manual long enough to keep them breathing. By dawn, the rain had stopped. The air carried the smell of cold soot and wet iron. The generator still ran, its hum lower now, but steady. Minton sat by it in silence, his logbook closed, gloves folded on the bench. The resin around the splice had hardened into a dull gray seam. It looked crude, functional, neither neat nor accidental. At 7:10 a.m., the inspection lorry arrived. 2 officers stepped out, followed by a senior engineer from London. Their uniforms were dry. They had traveled in heated comfort. The hut's floor was slick with mud. The lantern burned low. The engineer examined the repaired junction without speaking. He placed a gloved hand over the wire, felt the vibration of current, and looked at the meter. The needle held perfect center. No one asked what had happened. No one asked who had done it. The senior engineer marked the logbook once, a clean line under the last entry. Under investigation. His voice was measured, almost indifferent. He noted that official parts had arrived by morning convoy, only a few hours late. The report would show that protocol had been followed, supply delivered, issue resolved. Minton stood aside while they recorded readings. The generator coughed once, then resumed its rhythm. One inspector wrote in small letters, "Temporary circuit integrity maintained despite improper repair." It was the kind of phrasing designed to close a file. The men finished their notes, stamped a seal on the report, and left without a word. Their boots left shallow prints in the thawing ground. He watched their vehicle drive away, exhaust hanging pale against the morning fog. For the first time in 12 hours, the hut felt empty, too quiet, too clean. He touched the wire once more, then switched off the lantern. His orders would come by noon, by week's end. Minton was reassigned to an auxiliary depot near York. The letter called it a strategic personnel rotation. No one mentioned the investigation, but everyone knew what it meant. The system had corrected itself, not through punishment, but through removal. Quiet competence had become procedural inconvenience. The depot was smaller, less vital, a warehouse for spare turbines and scrap. Minton went about his work the same way, cleaning tools, checking circuits, logging temperatures. He spoke little, wrote neatly, and carried the same small tin in his pouch. The men there called him the tram man, without knowing why. Elsewhere, factories resumed normal production. The Manchester plant reported 0 downtime. Searchlight crews along the coast filed their success. Under favorable weather conditions. The foreman at the munitions plant later remarked in passing that someone up north kept the lights alive that night. but no name was attached, no citation issued. The report from the power station closed 2 weeks later. All records archived. The resin on Minton's repair held for the remainder of the war, never replaced, never mentioned again. For him, the silence was nothing new. Systems survived through men who worked unseen. And once a system survived, it no longer needed to remember how. Industrial endurance depends on invisible hands, those who act without permission and are quietly removed once order returns. Would you have waited for approval? Or kept the current alive knowing it would cost your name? Years later, after the war, Harold Minton returned to the same tram depot outside Leeds. The roof leaked now. The paint on the girders had peeled in long, curling strips. Machines that once hummed through the blackout ran slower, belts slipping, gears groaning with age. Yet the sound, that low, constant rhythm of a motor turning, still steadied him. He stood where he had once repaired brake lines for the city trams, tracing the same floor markings he had left behind years earlier. Nothing in the depot had changed much, except the men. The younger fitters didn't know what he had done during the war. They only knew he'd been with maintenance, some forgotten branch of the electrical corps. When asked about the raids, he gave the same answer every time: kept things running. The phrase sounded ordinary, unimportant, but to him, it was the whole truth condensed into 4 words. No record mentioned his name. No commendation reached him. The generator in Manchester had been dismantled years before, replaced by newer models from London. The report remained in storage. A single line noting temporary circuit integrity maintained. The phrase outlived every man who had signed it. The wire he spliced, the resin he melted, the scar on his wrist, all of it belonged to a story the system had quietly erased. Still, the grid he'd saved became legend in another form. Engineers who worked through the blackout cities began to repeat a quiet rule. No one wrote it down, but everyone knew it. Sometimes the system depends on the one who breaks it. Carefully. It was passed from workshop to classroom, depot to station. Not as defiance, but as duty. The understanding that machinery, like men, doesn't wait for orders when silence threatens to stop everything. Minton never corrected anyone. He fixed what was broken, cleaned his tools, and walked home with oil on his sleeves. On Sundays, he sat in the depot office, the one with the cracked clock and the smell of burned insulation. He would listen to the trams starting outside, each spark jumping between pole and wire, each connection humming into life. It sounded the same as that night, the faint thrum of current moving through wet air, refusing to die. He never spoke of Manchester. The war had ended, the lights stayed on, and that was enough. To him, victory wasn't a flag or a parade. It was the moment a system recovered without anyone noticing. Quiet success meant survival. Silence meant the machine still worked. By the time he retired, the depot had new supervisors, new methods, new manuals. His name disappeared from the roster. But in every station powered by men who understood the value of one unapproved repair, his legacy moved unseen, like current through hidden wire. Electricity and loyalty share one trait. Both fail in silence before they are seen. Would you have trusted the fix or waited for permission?